Good morning, everyone.
Hi, Jackson.
Good morning.
Yeah, Matt, I was going to tell you before we get started that, you did get word that, yeah, you were on the agenda and surprisingly got approved against the recommendation I gave him. So congrats, my friend.
Well, nice try.
Yeah. I did see your name when I was looking at the agenda. I saw you on there, so that's why I mentioned it the other morning. I thought, yeah, maybe you were on there, but I don't. They take too damn long to sit there and watch all the meeting, and especially I really didn't have anything significant on the agenda except I think maybe you were the only item or something for wastewater.
All right, it was exciting. Yeah, Eric and I had met with Supervisor Christie, I don't know, 10 days or so ago, and he mentioned at the time that my tenure was coming up and asked if I'd be willing to do it again. And so that just happened at a good time.
You're being way too nice. Matt, you're being way too nice. Supervisor Christie twisted your arm pretty hard.
Yeah. He had really nice things to say about you, Jackson.
That's because I went over there and paid my monthly protection money just before you were there,
I guess we're still waiting on a third to have a quorum, aren't we?
Let's see, we got Asia, Eric.
Oh no, Asia's there. I missed her.
Yeah, so you got three. That's your. Yep. So that's a quorum, and it's just after 9 o'clock. And let's see who else is maybe did Claire? She accepted, so maybe she'll be joining us shortly. But I would say we could probably get going.
Okay. In that case, I'll call the meeting to order, the January 26, 2024 meeting of the Regional Wastewater Reclamation Advisory Committee's Financial Subcommittee, and ask Jeanette to do a roll call, please.
Good morning. Asia Philbin, please. And you're muted, Asia.
Here, sorry.
Matt Mathewson.
Here.
Eric Solwald.
Here.
All right, we are missing Armando and Claire, but we have a quorum.
Very good. I'll go over the virtual meeting reminders, pretty standard for all of us, I think. Remember to mute your phone or mute your mic and your phone too. Mute your mics when you're not speaking. Use the raise your hand feature. If you have a question or comment, then remember to unmute your phone when you want to speak. And when you're done, do the lower your hand click, and remember to mute your phone again or your mic again, and asking the audience to participate only during the call to the audience items at the beginning and end of the meeting, and reminding everyone that this meeting is being recorded to satisfy state open meeting law requirements. With that, I'm going to mute my phone so it quits dinging. And please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands,
one nation,
under God,
under God.
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank
You know,
you.
I decided using Teams for the Pledge of Allegiance, I think it's got to be a solo act because the timing is always off.
Well, it makes kind of a neat echoey effect for the pledge. Huh? Okay, next is safety share. I guess one thing that comes to my mind because of very recent events is just part of safety is personal health, and getting good sleep is part of that. And I've learned that if you want to get a good night's sleep, don't, right before you go to bed, watch the University of Arizona basketball team play an away game at 9 o'clock at night, because they're sure to lose and put you in a deep depression and ruin your quality sleep. And so
Did they lose
no
last
more.
night?
They lost. It was amazing. The worst team in the Pac-12 we lost to. And next up is the best team. So let's hope they rise to that occasion. Unfortunately, that's not a 9 o'clock game.
Yeah.
Anybody else care to offer a safety share?
So Matt, if you see my eyes closed while we're doing this meeting, I'm just following your safety share, getting some sleep, you know?
Sounds good.
Matt, you skipped item E on the agenda.
I did, and I just told the audience to not participate until I called on them. So I better make that call to the audience. Are there any pre-meeting comments from audience members? Hearing none, I'll invite any other safety shares. And if none, we'll move on to the approval of the minutes of the March 13th, 2023 meeting of this subcommittee. Are there any changes or additions to those minutes? Hearing none, is there a motion for approval?
So moved.
Eric moves approval and Asia seconds. Thank you very much. Any discussion? All in favor of approval, say aye.
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 And that motion carries. Thank you very much.
And Matt, I do show that Armando joined us. So good morning, Armando. We're now at 4 people.
Wonderful.
Good morning.
Hey, Armando. Moving into the discussion and action items, number 1, to talk about the budget discussion, Jackson.
Yeah, so I just kind of put that as a catch-all, and really, you know, I want to leave the maximum time for finance, for the committee to hear everything that's out there. But I will just say that, you know, we're preparing, you know, more information to show the full committee and of course, obviously the Board of Supervisors and appropriate folks. But the request, first of all, our O&M budget, which is, you know, primarily, you know, what we're talking about at this point in time. The lion's share and significant portion of the increased request is inflationary driven, you know, like the chemicals and electricity. We're not asking for more of those. The unit prices have been increasing for the last 4 years, and we're just keeping up with those changes beyond our control. And that's the lion's share of it. So I wanted to bring that up. This is just me, you know, we did have a good meeting with Ellen and her team. I lose track, just like Ellen said, this is wastewater week. We've had too many meetings together, but a couple of days ago, I believe we discussed, you know, a lot of the stuff that she and her team will present to this subcommittee. But, you know, last year, or I talked last year, the current fiscal year, you know, when we did our budget submission and we did ask for more money at that time, there was several things where we had known values for some of the commodities that we purchase, and we did budget at those higher amounts. But there were some things we knew were escalating that we didn't have hard guaranteed numbers. And I was under the impression that this county contingency fund, the county set aside $5 million this fiscal year, primarily as a way to deal with inflation and especially the unknown parts for folks. But I thought, well, when the time comes, we'll get in line and get some of the contingency fund. But primarily my new realization, understanding, and Ellen can speak to it when she gets her turn here in a minute, if she wants to or needs to. But that really is a general fund contingency and not a wastewater contingency because we're an enterprise fund. So we're making sure that all of our submissions are everything we know, and we're pretty confident, you know, it covers, you know, where we're at with all these inflationary requirements. And so I don't anticipate having to use any contingency fund, and not that I could anyway, but we'll budget for the right amounts. And then, you know, we'll have to, when we budget, just the way the county requirement is. So we have our base budget. Here's what we asked for previously. So here's that amount, but here's why we're asking for X dollars more in chemicals, or X dollars more in electricity, or X dollars more in wages. You know, we have all those reasons, but those get submitted in the budget submission as supplemental requests. So the board or county administration or somebody could say, nope, we're not going to approve your electricity increase. And so, okay, well, we'll shut down part of our sewer system. You know, I'm just being facetious, of course, but we'll see how that works out. And that's kind of how it's going to be done. This current fiscal year, that's how we did it last year, but it was a fluid process, and we turned in several supplementals, but in the end, they all got rolled into our budget, and we'll see what happens now. But maybe Ellen will speak to that as she goes through her financial plan discussion. But I just kind of wanted to lay the groundwork. We're asking for more money. You did hear the CIP presentation yesterday, which also asked for more money, which, you know, Asia can repeat again, but her subcommittee of CIP endorses our request. You know, they support it, and that's kind of the message they're taking back to the main committee, and we'll go from there. But one thing that I'm not sure how we're going to deal with, and Ellen can speak to this also if she wants to or needs to, when we put in, you know, this is in the 5-year plan, we put in approximately $200 million for the Sarita regional program, and that's $166 million for a new 8 million gallon per day facility and 30-some million for interceptor pipeline over there. Those two kind of go hand in hand to make it all work. So $200 million investment. The town of Sarita is partners, or will be partners on this effort, and will provide some funding for their portion of that. The problem is, at this stage of the game, we don't know exactly what that looks like or what type of deal the board and the town will come to as far as financing. So in our financial plan at this moment, we're carrying the full burden of $200 million, which is driving some of these discussions. But I guarantee that a portion of those will be covered by the town, and we're working out trying to make sure our timing is right on that investment and the respective proportions that each entity would need to invest in. So I just wanted to make sure that was an awareness that this subcommittee had. And with that, I'll just shut up for now, Matt, and let you continue, and I'll insert myself as needed throughout the meeting.
Okay, thanks, Jackson. A concern about that contingency funding. My recollection is, and reading over last year's minutes, that at this time last year, we were expecting to be able to draw on that contingency fund. So that turned out not to be true, or possible.
That was it sounds like that's an incorrect assumption. But like I said, Ellen can speak to it as you direct.
And then we saw yesterday that things are pretty well on track for the current year. That forecasts and projections appear to be, reasonably balancing out for the end of the year. So with all of the contingent or all of the supplementals that you included, at this point anyway, it appears as though the current year's budget was adequately constructed. Is that fair?
Actually, we're forecasting to spend more in electricity and chemical than we budgeted for. But of course, we have vacancy savings on our wages and benefits that, offset. We're basically in a pretty balanced position at this time. But, of course, I'm always worried, we're only 7 out of 12 months through basically. And, I still have to buy the chemical and use the electricity and pay the wages. But we're always looking at anything we can do to offset and hedge that concern.
Yeah. Okay. All right, then let's move to the next item and invite Ellen to give us a discussion of the next year financial plan.
Thank you. I'd first like to address your issue on what was included in wastewater's budget this year. So there was a $4.6 million supplemental that was approved, and it was specifically related to operations and maintenance increases to handle inflation. So there was an increase to the overall wastewater-based budget of $4.5 million. With regard to the general fund inflation contingency, there are two things to remember when we're talking about a budget and contingency. One is budget authority. And if wastewater needs to draw on budget authority from the contingency, that is available. If what is not available is wastewater's ability to draw on the cash that is part of that contingency. So there are always two parts, and I apologize if we were not clear in breaking that up. If wastewater goes over budget and I need to move budget authority, then that's it, that we can do from the contingency line item. Wastewater has sufficient cash, so the general fund would never, in the current circumstances, move cash to cover his budget overage. So it's a little bit of a nuanced explanation. And like I said, I apologize if I was not clear on that. This is one of those finance speak moments where I know what I'm talking about. I don't know why you guys don't know what I'm talking about. So I'll try to be more clear as far as that goes in the future. So Jackson is correct. He is currently on target overall for his budget due to vacancies and other things. He is also accurate in his electricity has gone up significantly this year. As part of our overall report to the Board of Supervisors on the county's health, we did an overall analysis on electricity, which did include wastewater, and it did show that they are having significant increase, but their budget right now is able to cover that.
Yeah,
So,
and thanks for that clarification, Ellen, on the contingency fund. And I believe just how you repeated it is how I remember it, but my brain didn't receive it in that way. So now I understand the difference between the authority and the cash. And yeah, because we do have some cash reserves and always could cover our costs, but we need the authority to do so.
Correct.
So thanks for that clarification.
no
Yes,
problem.
and thank you, Ellen. And I just noticed Armando has his hand up, so I'll invite him to ask a question or give a comment.
Thank you. 2 questions, and I think I've got the difference between authority and cash. And thank you for that, Ellen. but you raised electricity rates going up, and I thought we had gone to the sun catching electricity to offset that cost. And why is that higher now? Or is
So-
it higher?
The analysis that we did was strictly on the TEP electricity bills. It did not involve any solar, if that's what you're talking about. And I cannot speak with any authority about how the solar plants that we have at Wastewater are helping lower our overall electricity bills. And if that is your question, I would have to turn that back to Jackson for.
Yeah,
Both-
that was
both
actually
of-
my question.
So both of the solar facilities that wastewater has, they're third-party owned and have contracts at fixed unit price per kilowatt hour that do not change over what I believe was a 20-year period of time. I mean, these things are well into that 20 years, but the price has not changed. Early on in the cycle, the unit price was higher than the commercial TEP price. So we were actually paying more for electricity than we would have if we did all TEP. But over time, as TEP's rates have gone up, I think we now have crossed a threshold. I'd have to go back and do the calculations because both contracts are at a slightly different solar unit price. But I think now these last handful of years, maybe solar will start saving us money. It'll be hard to determine whether the net project is a savings, but we can all be happy we were greener and more sustainable. But in the end, the way those were set up, I don't think the project ultimately will pay for itself in the 20 years that we have it, but that's just my editorial piece. But now with the latest increase, I think we're on the saving side with the solar. Those prices don't change. They don't have an inflationary escalator. They're fixed for the 20 years.
Which leads to the question. So after the 20 years, do we just junk it or recontract or what do we do?
So 20 years is kind of what they're set at because the solar facilities themselves, they have a finite life. You know, they degrade over time, and little by little, they decrease the amount of kilowatt outputs. And so at 20 years, that's kind of an estimate that they're kind of getting to the point of, maybe it's not worth it anymore. And maybe new technology will allow you to do another investment and put in some better, lower cost solar, if that's the case, or the market for commercial is better. You make a business decision at that time. But as we still will have to evaluate, do we want to buy what's remaining and just pay the owners out for some pennies on the dollar and get some really cheap power, with the lower output that it makes? Or do we want to shut it down and say, hey, we'd be better off with commercial, get your shit off our property, pardon my French. But, we could do that, or we could look at buying it if the price was right and getting a little bit of additional benefit out of continued solar, inefficient solar that would be, not producing as much as it did in its heyday when it was first put in. So those are all options that we will evaluate as we get a little closer, Armando.
Thanks. How much time do we have left?
I think there's a year or two difference between the two projects, but I don't know if anybody on the call, Marla or anybody remembers, but I can't imagine it's more than 5 years left. And maybe it's a little less than 5 on one and a little more than 5 on the other. I don't remember, but I'll just say it's close to 5 years.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Armando. And then hand it back to Ellen to continue.
All right, so part of what we want to discuss today, and I am going to share my screen. This is the first part of the rate workbook that we would have showed you yesterday at the larger RWRAC committee. And so I just want to go over it, not in as much detail as Michelle did yesterday. And she will certainly interrupt me when I go off the rails, or if I say anything that was not quite accurate. So as you know,
Yes. I'll interrupt you, Ellen, at the beginning. We did not receive this, anything on this yesterday.
Okay, so that was the other meeting that we had with wastewater. So I apologize. So I will go through it in a little bit more detail. So
Great,
this
thank you.
should be familiar to you. It is the standard workbook assumptions page for the actuals for 23, the budget for 24, the forecast for 24, and then the assumptions for the next 5 years. This section here at the top is the overall assumptions. We have the customers, and you can see there is customer growth anticipated going out through 2029. The growth is...
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, Ellen, you were getting into it, but just to make sure they all remember, we're using the U of A values because there's different values out there, but it's U of A as it says there.
Right, so I'm going to go through line by line. So the population growth comes from the U of A estimates, and you can see that it is slight, but it is still growing. Go all 5 years into the future. We have our volume rate, and then we also have a rate factor where we say we anticipate we're going to need to increase rates. You can see that it is set at 1, so no rate increases until we get to the 2 columns that are in pink, which is 26, 27, and 27, 28. I need to say that this is predicated on the current approved capital plan, which is about $66 million lower than the one that Jackson and his team is proposing for 25. So I want to set this as the baseline. You can see here that we are estimating the CCF is staying around 9 for our calculated flow, and we are not anticipating any increase in that. So as we move down here to the other assumptions, the revenue and the expenditures, those all flow from the assumptions at the top. One of the things I need to remind the committee is that there are 3 pillars that county administration has provided us in the past to work under. The first was that we were to try to have continued decreasing length of debt sales. The goal was to move us to a pay-as-you-go model. We are currently at 10 years. We are not able to go lower than that right now, so we're kind of stagnant at the 10-year life of the debt. The second pillar, if you will, was to keep debt service between $60 and $65 million. And then the third pillar was to continue to defease debt at about a $20 million a year rate, keeping our available cash in the $50 million range. So those are 3 underlying assumptions, financial assumptions that go into this model. You can see here that with the expected increase in sorry, I lost my place, so just give me a second. Oh, up here at the top, there is a factor for the O&M expense increases. You can see that in fiscal year 23, actual expenses at wastewater went up almost 6.7%. In the current year adopted budget, we had layered in a 7.4% increase. What we're actually seeing in the current year is a 9% increase. So we are seeing the inflationary pressure on increased costs, that plus the increase in salaries and benefits that were accomplished this year through the class and comp. In next year's budget, we are looking at approximately a 6% increase in costs. And this is not predicated on the latest submission by Wastewater, but it is close. But then you can see we're going back to a 3% increase. I don't know that that is actually sustainable given where we are. And that is, I believe, the first point of discussion that we should be having. Do we believe that wastewater can move back to a 3% year-over-year increase in R&M, O&M costs?
I don't know who's got that crystal ball. You know, there's so many things tied to what, you know, historic inflation was typically less than 3% until
Correct.
these last 4 years. And then it shot up exponentially to the rates that we've seen. So, whose crystal ball do you want to use?
Well,
I think it's going to be 0, Ellen. Let's put 0 in there.
Okay, Jackson, thank you very much for your comments. Moving on to someone who might have something more pertinent to add. My concern is that I believe that 3% might be a little too low, given what we've seen, just what I've just showed you, 6.5, 7.5, 9. We're budgeting for 6. I'm thinking that 3 might be an aggressive number, and I'm not sure that it's reasonable.
And you go before that, I'm sorry to jump in before Eric has his hands up, but the years before that, it was closer to 2 to 2.5 is the numbers that we use. So, you know, it could be either way. You want to call on Eric there, Matt?
Yes, please. Go ahead, Eric, and then Armando.
Yeah, I'm more of a skeptic and a conservative on that. And I think that in the future here, we're going to see the carryover of what inflation has done to us now, and we're going to see it to be continually higher than the 3% that we're seeing. It might by 28, 29 drop down, but I am not comfortable with that.
And Armando?
Well, I'm kind of in agreement, but my concern is the higher number we go, won't that raise eyebrows with the board? Not only the board, but with the constituents.
Well, what that will do is that will force a higher increase in revenue. We will have to increase our rates higher. I just putting it out there for discussion purposes. What I think is we layered back in the 3% because that is, you know, what we're hoping for.
Well, in an election
I actually think that we should feather it down a little bit, so that maybe in 25, 26, we put a 4% inflator instead of 3, and then drop 26, 27 to 3%. We are indicating in a lot of the documentation that finance is publishing to the board, continued upward pressure. We're seeing that more than just the continued increase in inflation. We are seeing prices not coming down. So while they might not be going up as high, they are not coming down as fast. So there's some, I think the word is sticking at those higher levels, and it's taking longer for it to come back down. So we're looking for, this is the first model that we've done for you. This is the direction that the staff took for me to do. And you can see that it requires a 3% increase in 27 and 28. The question is, if you don't believe that we can get the wastewater O&M expenditures back down to a 3% year-over-year increase, then we need to change that assumption.
So my question now is, keeping it at that, at what point do we need to ask to raise our rates and the blowback we're gonna get from that?
Well, that's why we're having this discussion right now. This, again, is predicated on a much lower CIP model. The same assumption, so if you bear with me for just a second, this is predicated on the $66+ million increase in the CIP budget over the next 5 years that was delivered to the CIP subcommittee and that Jaime talked about yesterday. So what you can see here is that with that model, all other things being equal, we're going to have to go for rate increases in fiscal year 25-26 and sustained for at least 4 years. One of the issues with this model is you can still see here, we're still showing the 3%, inflator. See our previous discussion. Is that reasonable? If I increase this, these go up. That's just a function of math. So we will have to increase that. The other issue that we have with this kind of CIP projections is that it is going to violate at least 2 of those pillars that we talked about, trying to lower our average life of debt issuance. When we get down here to issuing $100 million a year, I cannot issue that and pay it back in 10 years and keep the debt service at $60 to $65 million. So there are a couple of major issues that are at play right here. This overall increase goes against the tenets and the pillars that we have been told we're supposed to hold. Jackson and I have a meeting scheduled with Carmine early next week to talk about that directly. But right now, from my perspective, I need to get some direction from you with regard to these O&M expenses, what you would like to see with regard to the inflation there. What I can then do is run another model, not me specifically, it will be Michelle and her team. Let's be very clear who's doing the actual work here. She can run us another model, and I would like to see that go out a couple of more years so that you can see the impact that that debt service is going to have, because that's huge. As Jackson indicated, embedded in here in these numbers for CIP projections is wastewater bearing the entire freight for the Sahuarita plant. Until Jackson can tell me what percentage Sahuarita is going to put into the project, we have to model it as if wastewater is paying for the whole thing.
Let me call on
Thank you.
Asia for a comment, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm very interested in what you were just talking about, but I'm kind of have a question that's related, because I was thinking about the comments that Jackson made about the price increases and sort of the percents of increase. And, we're talking about them as inflationary, but it does seem like there's also, like a differential, right? It does seem like they were a lot higher. Some of the costs that you've seen go up were significantly higher than like even the high rates of inflation, if you know what I'm saying. And I'm wondering if that's something that you can quantify at all to kind of give us, like, I think that might be important, right? If wastewater chemical costs, if those kind of things are going up, more than just regular inflation, that would be something important to understand about why wastewater costs, or, whether we would be able to bring that back down within the levels of spending we were talking about before. So I don't want to get off the track of understanding like what the impacts of all of, how this all flows through. But I don't think we can, like, understanding the pillars. I don't think if we can't control the size of the pillar, we just have to react to it in the best way. I don't know, Matt, and Jackson, what are your thoughts on what this inflation versus price gouging versus, I don't know, what's happening?
Asia, that's a great comment you make. And, basically in a perfect world, if we're very consistent and maintain a status quo, if inflation goes up 3%, well, you would anticipate that wastewater's costs would go up 3%. They typically track. For the longest time, we've been doing so many different things of efficiencies and creative financing and low interest rates and, all the things that have competed to keep our costs down have beaten inflation or kept us in a great place where we haven't raised our rates in like 7 years or whatever the math is now, which is unheard of. You go look at any and every utility out there and they're all raising rates, sometimes double digits. But okay, I think that's great. But and I hate the term, low hanging fruit, but it's all been picked and there isn't much fruit at the top of the tree either. So we're going to do what we have to do. And, the board, of course, they set policy and I'm a good, steward and soldier of their policy. But I'll tell you what, if it's nice to pay as you go, that's wonderful. But take into consideration realities of running a big utility. It has different demands than maybe many other programs in the county's system. So that may not be a practical option for us. And if somebody's going to allude, well, we should just cut these things or not do certain things, well, you're taking the utility in a different direction than we've been spending the past dozen years taking it. So, that's a policy decision by the board. But I will argue that we've been working our tails off, headed in the right direction for running a professional, well operated, well maintained, and appropriate quality of infrastructure utility in this community. And you got to be careful you don't go down a slippery slope and start turning around how things were in the early 2000 range, where we weren't investing enough in the utility and things were in really bad shape. So I don't know if that is a comment, Asia, for you, but that's what I had to say.
Thanks, Jackson, and thank you, Asia, for that. I guess I've got some comments as well, but I think I'd like to be sure that Ellen's got a wrap on her presentation as far as the workbook goes, or whether, Ellen, you would find it constructive to continue in a discussion mode.
I think that I still need to get some direction, or would you like me to produce some additional scenarios? With regard to Jackson's commentary on the pay as you go, yes, we have the plan. The direction a number of years ago was to try to bring it down to the 5 or 6 year life of a debt. We got it down to 9. We're back up to 10. We finance don't believe we can get it below 10. With some of these significant increases in capital investment in the CIP projection, it is pushing that. If we want to keep the one pillar at 60 to 65, we have to increase the length of the debt. If we keep to the 10-year mark, we increase the cost of debt service. So I am going to have Michelle run it out a couple of more years, keeping the debt at 10 years so that you can see what that does. My only other question comes back to this, the rate factor for O&M expenses. So what would you like us to produce? Would you like me to assume in 26 that it's a 5 or a 4% inflation factor, and then the next year drop it back down 1, and then I'm at 3 and 3? We can certainly run that kind of scenario. Any changes to that will increase the pink line that you see, which is, you know, if I increase costs, I have to increase revenue. So those are the, you know, if I change in one lever, it will change another item on here. And I just need some direction so I can run some more scenarios.
Go ahead, Jackson.
Yeah, so, you know, just seeing this also, I mean, we just had a meeting yesterday or day before with finance and started to talk about this. So I haven't had much time on this rate workbook and all the information, but some comments, just FYI, my opinion, I think it's probably a good thing to put the 25, 26 at a 4%. I would support that personally. You know, so you have one more step down to give us a little more buffer, and then leave the 3% going forward for now. But the other thing, I don't know what interest rate is being used for the debt that we're incurring. Do you have a number somewhere on here?
It's not on here, but I can tell you that and Michelle will correct me if I'm wrong, we're at 4%.
Well, actually, in the calculation, it's 5% because the coupon we pay on all the debt is 5%. We just usually get a premium. And so I don't know if you can scroll to, well, I guess it doesn't show on this spreadsheet as well as on some of the other spreadsheets. This is if you do go to the bottom, Ellen, and I'm sorry if I'm overstepping, but see how in the first column where we issued, we're saying we issued debt 40 million, right? Or we're issuing debt the current year of 45 million. The par on the debt isn't 45 because we will issue 40 and get a premium for it. So the actual yield on the debt was, I think, 3.8. Do you know what I mean? But we use 5 and then we don't take the premium into account. Does that make sense? So
Yeah, so
this has historically worked for us because right now the actual yield we're paying is close to 4%. You know, we were mid 3s last year when we issued, and we were high 3s this year when we issued. But we're taking into account that premium. And when we're doing the debt calculation, we're using the net amount of the par times 5%.
yeah, and so that's why I asked the question. You know, and this is you know, we have a whole lot of diversity on people on this meeting, and everybody has their own financial perspective and outlook for different reasons and different backgrounds and experience. But I always think when we do these rate workbooks, historically, you know, each line item you go through, we're conservative, you know, which is a good way to plan. You want to make sure you have enough funds or, you know, enough funding for your business. But everything is always a little conservative. And when you take the sum of the whole, it's, you know, it's a pretty conservative recommendation. And I'm always cautious about that we don't push ourselves further than we really need to be pushed in consideration of rates. And so take that how you will, but that's a comment. So I wanted to hear what that rate is, 5%. And okay, that's something to consider. It's not shown here, but it's something to keep in mind in the discussion. But the other thing I wanted to bring to everyone's attention, if you can scroll back up, Ellen, if you don't mind. So when we show the rate factor that's highlighted in pink or whatever color that is at 3%, that is just the volume fee that appears to me is run with just the volume fee. So that is not a 3% user fee increase. In fact, based on average residential billing right now, that's closer today to about a 1.5% increase because the the fixed fee is it's about a $26 a month average bill for the resident. So if you put 3% on half of the bill, that's a 1.5 total, roughly. I mean, the math is whatever it is. So I would suggest that whatever percent increase we do, we also do it to the service charge rate, the $13, the fixed fee. It's all inflationary, so why isn't this all going up at about the same amount and keeping that proportion consistent? That's just one thought. And so, it could be a 2% and then the 13 is 2%, I mean, whatever the model spits out as an actual number, but I'm throwing that in there. And then just another thing that it's got to be in here somewhere. It's a smaller portion of our revenue because user fees are like 90% or something. But the wastewater utility fee, previously called the connection fee for new connections, we've looked at what construction cost inflation has done because we live it every day with our own capital projects, and the current price tags associated with water meter fee size, related to the water meter size is what generates the wastewater utility fee. Previously, that was done using $16.02 per gallon of constructed capacity to come up with those numbers. We're now seeing that it's pretty close to a round number, but we're seeing $20 per gallon as the new cost. Like that's what we're using when we're building the Sarita plant. And so we think that the utility connection fee, the WOOF wastewater utility fee, should go proportional, whatever 16.02 over 20 is. That proportion should be multiplied times each meter size and times the revenue. So that would also be an increase in revenue, and it would be appropriate at this time. And it would be a good discussion, as we're raising fees. It's not just on the user's fees, it's also on development and growth in the construction side. So those were my comments on this workbook now that I've seen it a little bit.
So Jack, then the sewer utility fee revenue is listed here. You can see that in fiscal 23, we received $13.2 million in revenue. We budgeted 14.5. You're telling us we're only going to get 14.5, so we're not seeing a huge increase there. We're seeing it's going to come in on budget. In 25, we've got it budgeted to come in at just under 15 million. So you're seeing, I don't know what that percentage increase is, but you're seeing a $500,000 basically increase in that revenue from 24 to 25. And then that is flat going forward. Are you suggesting that that needs to be changed? Because I don't believe that, I hear what you're saying, that the costs are going up, but I don't believe that our revenue stream in the current year is going up as you described.
Yeah, but if you go prior to 23, we were getting 16, 17, 18 million in revenue. It dropped off in that pandemic timeframe when the wheels fell off of the bus. And I'm projecting it will return to somewhat, but I'm just saying a one-time blip. So let's just say 14.5 is the right number, based on the amount of connections we're expecting. Well, if the rate to pay for those connections went up by 16 divide 20 equals 0.8. What is that difference? 16 over 20, is that 8%? Or am I missing a decimal here? Somebody do the math for me. Or is it 20 over 16? I think I'm doing the math wrong here.
Yeah, I think, are you saying you'd multiply 20 over 16
It's
times
like
whatever?
a 25% increase going up 4 over 16.
Yeah, and that's what construction costs have done, and that's how we based our connection fee in the past. And that's what we have in here that's how we came up with the Sarita cost, real live numbers, and that's what we're using. So I'm saying, why aren't we raising, in the past, we typically raised the connection fees and the user fees. Always the comment was, well, growth and development has to pay for itself. And the real cost and impact to our capacity, if we had to replace that capacity by building a new plant. It's not $16.02 per gallon, it's $20. So the utility fee, the wastewater utility fee should increase as well.
So we currently have the rate factor for the connection fee at flat. You are correct. We are not anticipating anything going up because that has been our historical trend. We haven't modeled that. What would you like it modeled at? I don't think that you can put in a 25% increase.
Yeah.
I don't think that would be palatable for the board to approve or for your customers to pay. I hear what you're saying. What percentage would you like to include in that? Is it a 5% increase because we haven't done it for a number of years?
Yeah, well, it's again, it's going to ultimately be the board how they want to tell the story, but I'm a practical guy and I can show construction costs. This is what it costs to replace the capacity that someone's taken, you know, when they put a new connection in our system. And so all these years, these same 7 years, we haven't raised that fee up, even though inflation, you know, we should have been raising that fee up every year if you want, especially in years with big inflation. But guess what? It's totaled up to 25% now. That's how much more it costs to do, you know, to build capacity than it did in previous years. So yeah, it's 25. And if somebody's, the fallback from that is extreme, well, it's not just a one-time 5%. You need to get up to that cost, and we need to add that increase on some regular interval too, just like your pink line is showing a 3% increase in user fees every year. Well, then we better start working on the connection fee. It's a smaller percentage of revenue, so it's not a huge impact, but we should equilibrate our revenue stream appropriately, and that's where that cost needs to go up as well. And it's not just, hey, some arbitrary number. It's the real number that we're seeing in our construction costs for capacity.
Okay.
So how you get to 25%, I don't know, but it is $20 a gallon and not 16.02 that we used back umpteen years ago when we made that formula. And we used, what was the one firm? I can't think of that financial firm. We went through a pretty elaborate, rate type model and looked at how much capacity we had and the cost of capacity. And that still holds true, but the cost to build that capacity has gone up a lot since inflation.
Okay.
So I guess one question that I have, Alan, about the pillars. Where do those come from? What's the, I guess, legal basis for those? Are they finance policy, wastewater policy? Are they, determined by board ordinance, or?
They are direction, so policy coming at the county administrative level.
And I would guess those policies are informed by your recommendations.
Those policies have been in place for a number of years. I want to say more than 5. So they predate me. This is part of the conversation that Jackson and I are going to have with Carmine about these pillars. Do we need to tweak some of them? They need to be reviewed every so often. These are policy decisions, as we move forward with anything. You review the policies that you have in place with the decision makers so that they can say, yeah, these are still reasonable. Our recommendations are going to be, are these still reasonable? Right now, I do not believe that moving wastewater to a 5-year pay-as-you-go CIP program is reasonable. I don't think that is a reasonable place to assume. Hence the reason we have been paused for the last couple of years at the 10 years of debt service. So that's part of the conversation that Jackson and I are going to be having with Carmine. And then that conversation will inform the conversation we have with Jan Lesher as the administrator for the county.
Yeah, it would seem to me that just like there were different rules for the enterprise fund this past year and dealing with the contingency funding, that maybe there should be some different rules for an enterprise fund in establishing its financial pillars. And
Well, these pillars are specifically for wastewater. They're not for anybody else. I mean, everybody else in the county is on a 5-year pay-as-you-go plan. No one else has has a $65 million debt service annual. Those are all specific to wastewater. So those are not generic across the board county policies, because the generic across the board county policy was to move all capital to a pay-as-you-go process.
And Matt, and really for anybody that hadn't followed the county history, the county, for as long as I can remember, used to be on a bond program of 15-year cycle. You borrow for 15 years, and then it went to this concept of pay-as-you-go, like Alan said, some number of years ago. And the goal was to go from the 15 to get it down towards the 5. And then it looked like, hey, that's going to be a big challenge for the amount of capital you borrow for wastewater. And so it's stalled out or settled around 10 and seems, well, okay, let's shoot for 10 for wastewater. But, it's kind of that model of, you could go look at other utilities. Some of them use 20 or even more than 20-year cycles. And so it's really a philosophy, and it's what does the county administration and or the board want to do, and what makes sense in the types of business that we have. But somebody needs to make that decision, because that will impact rates. And, we're spending capital money on infrastructure that will last many and many of years. So, some people complain, well, you shouldn't burden today's people for something that folks down the road are going to benefit from as well. We should spread it out, and then there's other good financial, I live my life to have as little debt as possible and pay it off as soon as you can. And of course, if I buy a car, okay, I can do that. But if I buy a home, a mortgage is going to take a little bit longer to do. So again, it's just the differences in the way we run our business, but somebody has to agree on the philosophy that we're held to, and it's only going to impact rates. You could say, nope, you're still going to get to 5 years. Well, those 3% increases are a little bit anemic. We're going to jump them up a lot more than that if that's our goal. And of course, that's going to get pushed back in rebellion and pitchforks and torches. So we just need to kind of realize that, hey, this is the cost of running a utility, and I'm not being facetious, because we're not being frivolous. Sure, we can talk about one project here or there, or, something that maybe, okay, let's delay this. But all in all, we're trying to maintain quality infrastructure and a professional utility. And when somebody says that's not what we need to do anymore, well, that's not a good plan, because we've seen how it was before, and I hope nobody wants to go back that direction. But at any rate, I'll shut up.
Well, and I do recall the 15-year approach that Mr. Huckleberry had, and I remember thinking probably close to 15 years ago that when you're doing a project the size of, at the time, ROMP, it didn't make a lot of sense to have to cram that into 15 years. And maybe there's a good reason for something like the Sahuarita plant that's an out of the ordinary investment to be considered with a little bit of an exceptional view, and try to be more realistic in the impact that it's going to have on today's ratepayers versus those a few years from now.
And Matt, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just thought of something that, well, I'll make the request. I mean, I need to see it anyway, but I'm sure it will be helpful for your subcommittee. And Ellen, it might be worth, once we settle on what factors and values to put in this workbook that you're going to run, the sensitivities I would like to see for this same picture is, if we assumed Sahuarita was going to pay 20%, and 30% and 40, some increment, starting at maybe 20%, because to me, that seems like a reasonable, on an 8 million gallon per day facility, they're gonna want to probably have maybe 2 million of it initially, but later that's gonna expand and they're gonna take the lion's share in the future based on our current, both of our respective growth projections. So we might just look at what happens if that 200 million investment is only 180 or 160 or 150 or some other number, just so we know how that impacts these rates, because that's really going to happen. We just don't know what exact percentage of their contribution to that investment it's going to be.
So the Sarita plant is 166, not 2 million.
No, the
200.
30, there's up above is a 33.5 million Interceptor, Sarita, Green Valley.
Yeah.
Jaime changed it he put those side by side because they both go together. You have to have the Interceptor in order to run this new plant and get the flows to it.
And Sarita will be, you want us to assume Sarita pays 20% of the combined projects?
Correct.
Okay. And are they paying that cost real time, as in 20% of the costs associated with fiscal year 26, 20% of the costs associated with 20, so I can layer the 20% in according to the timeline that you've got on your CIP?
I would recommend we do so. Of course, that's the detail in the IGA that has to be worked out. But if they were part of our system, that's how they would be paying it. Now, if they go beg the board to cover them longer or something, who knows where it'll come out. But from a straight view, in fact, if we're just looking at one iteration, I would say a quarter, 25% is probably most realistic at what I know today. If I had to throw a guess at you, I would say 25% would be their initial buy-in participation level. And over time, their overall ownership will shift to a larger amount as that plant, fills out and expands, because they have some bigger growth projections than we do longer term.
Okay, so just to wrap this back up again. So what we are going to do in finance is we are going to take a look at putting looking at the increase for the volume and the service charge, keeping that relationship the way it is right now. In the example that you used, Jackson, was that the average bill is $26, half is admin fee, half is volume, trying to keep that relationship the same. So we'll see an increase here in the service charge. In the service charge, instead of keeping it flat, we will escalate it a little bit. That will cause, and I need to get into the right workbook, this one, that may cause the 3% to go down a little bit. You also want us to take a look at the O&M rate factor and layer in for 25, 26, a 4% increase, and then back down to 3 and 3 and 3. And then finally, and then you want the connection fees to go up. You're suggesting that it deserves a 25% increase. We'll feather that in what we think might be an acceptable going forward. It won't be 25% in 1 year. It will be a layered impact to get us to 25% over a fill in the blank number of years. And then finally, to put in a revenue projection that the Sarita town will pay 25% of the 2 Sarita CIP projects in the year that the CIP is being expended.
That's correct. All those things meet my recommendation or support, but this is Matt's meeting. So once again, I have to shut up and see if Matt wants to see that or anything else.
For me, I'd say it's worth looking at, and we need to have some of these scenarios kind of fleshed out to really be able to get our arms around the whole picture and then be able to come up with a recommendation in the end. So I'd say yes, and I'll invite other input from other committee members, but yes, that we should consider these options that the department is interested in seeing. I know wastewater doesn't have its own financial staff, so you're looking at Jackson there to as kind of the Lone Ranger to be able to reflect what he thinks the right financial scenarios are going to be, and then really has to rely on the finance department to give him good recommendations on the direction. And so I think the committee would have the same expectation that we need good, solid information and then good, solid recommendations on how to proceed. And while I've got the floor, before asking any other committee members if they have comments, we're a little after 10 o'clock. I think the meeting is set to go till 11. Do we have a hard exit at 11 o'clock, Ellen and Jackson, or how does our time constraints look?
My schedule's clear. I can go longer if need be, but I'm only speaking for myself.
I have a meeting at 11 that I am not required to be at, so I can go past 11.
And I guess one thing that I really want to have an understanding of that I currently don't, and I'm not sure the rest of the committee does either, are the pillars, the other two pillars, the defeasance pillar and the cash pillar. Well, I guess that's the third one, but the big problem that I'm having right now and looking to the future for the potential of rate increases is the impact. We've got the chart that shows the debt service kind of flattening out indefinitely. And compared to the debt service chart we saw 10 years ago that showed a drastic decline of debt service in the years that we're dealing with right now. I don't understand what defeasance is and what impacts defeasance has on either our debt service trends or our debt service ratio, and I'd like to have that understanding and what basically what the differences are between the old chart and the new chart.
Well, I can speak to a little bit about the old chart versus the new chart. The old chart that had a precipitous drop off did not anticipate any additional debt issuances based on what we were able to review. What you have with the new chart is, continuing to assume a $50 million ongoing CIP program in perpetuity. Michelle, did I get that right?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Matt, I just wanted to clarify. I mean, if we took the current chart, so the chart that is not the pig and the python, if we took that out another 10 years and assumed that we never issue debt again after 2029, you would see the same trend. It's just assuming that starting in 2030, you're never going to need to issue debt again. I question the validity of that assumption. That's where I guess I did not specifically ask for the time frame 2010 through 2030. I'd be happy to extend it out to 2040 so that you could see the drop off. But please understand, in my opinion, that is an artificial drop off, because I don't see a scenario in which beginning in 2030, you never issue debt again for the utility. But if you would like to see it, I'd be happy to put it together. But it's understanding the assumptions behind the graph. And like I said, I went back and recreated the old graph. And so I know it included 4 years, I believe it was 4 years of new debt, because that was what was in that financial plan in 2015. And then it assumed there was no additional debt issues. That's why it dropped off. Again, we could mimic the same thing, but realize the implication of that in the story that it tells. I mean, it tells a story of not only are you on a 5-year pay-go, you're on a 0 pay-go. Do you know what I mean? You have no debts. You have no debt program. Does that make sense?
So you're saying that that's what the old chart assumed for the tail end.
Right. So that it assumed that there were no new debt issues. I believe it was after 2020, that no additional debt was issued after 2020. And that's why you saw that drop off.
But it got us back to a point, even in those years' dollars, with where it was before ROMP, that we were at a, say, $25 million annual CIP program before ROMP, and now the annual CIP program has doubled, which, I mean, after that many years, I guess that's not unreasonable to expect. But does that mean that the current and foreseeable CIP programs remain at virtually as high a level as ROMP was at its highest level? I mean, from the chart you've got up there, I don't see much of a difference between the ROMP bubble and the current and projected CIP levels.
And you're
So
reading that chart correctly. The goal, one of the other goals was wastewater was supposed to stay at about $40 million worth of debt, worth of CIP projects, between 40 and 45 after ROMP. As you know, we are well above that. And that is when you look at their CIP, you know, 50, 53, 53, 56, 68, you know, we're right back up there, and, you know, it's not dropping back down. And that's a function of what wastewater has indicated is required. You've got $20 million in those rehab buckets, you know, plus whatever projects that you have going on. So you've got a baseline of rehab of $20 million. And then you've got all of the additional projects on top of that. So yeah, you're absolutely correct. You are reading this graph correctly. That the way wastewater is planning its CIP program is at a significantly higher level than was discussed during the ROMP ramp up and what was anticipated to happen after ROMP. You can see that there was a little bit of a dip, but not much. And then we are right back up there. Issuing $100 million worth of debt in those last 2 fiscal years that are on the CIP plan is equivalent to what we were issuing for ROMP.
And yet there's a pretty So on the old chart, the peak is almost 90 million. On the one that's in front of us, the peak is what, 75 million. Still quite a difference between 75 and 55. And that's $20 million of debt service that we're not having to pay in now or soon and in the future, but for Sahuarita. And I think that level of say $20 million a year should be able to offset some of these increases that we're talking about happening that are driven by inflation.
Hey, if I could, just some real simple math too. If Sahuarita pays 25%, which is a reasonable guess at this point, 25% of 200 million is 50 million. And we've increased our request for 5 years by about 65 million. So we've only come up a few $1 million a year with things that we're seeing we have to do. And some of those are even being pushed by other influence. So I think there's a very reasonable story to tell. Just saying that, you better invest in rehab on 1.2, $1.3 billion of assets. 3 to 5 is kind of a rule of thumb. Well, with the age of some of our system, that 5% might be the amount, and 5% of 1.3 million, guess what? That's $65 million that we should be reinvesting in the system. Just for rehab.
And what are we investing now just for rehab?
Well, we have a baseline of 21 million. Those are the buckets that are basically rehab. But some of the new projects that popped up, like the digester and the primary clarifier, those are because of aging infrastructure. We need to do those. So they could be classified as rehab, but they're standalone separate projects because they're big line items.
I think going back to Michelle's offer to show the rest of the story on this chart, I think I would like to see how the successive years are reflected. If this chart was inartfully drawn to not be able to consider the effect of continuing investment at a proper level in CIP, I think, and it kind of sucked us into a feeling that at some point we're going to be able to reduce rates, maybe. I mean, I remember having that discussion year after year in the middle of the hump there. Then I think I'd like to be able to have a more accurate and realistic projection of what the future looks like for us.
Hey, Matt, just a perspective to keep in mind too. Not having a rate increase over the past 7, now looking at this financial model, 8 years is the same with inflation. What's going on is the same as a rate decrease, theoretically, just so you know.
Yes, and I do recognize that, and I remember saying, some number of meetings ago that although it looked like the chances of getting a rate decrease were none. Clearly none at this point. Maybe that at least would mean that we wouldn't need to have a rate increase, that it would be offset. So yeah, I get that, and
I'm sorry, Matt, just to clarify, so you want me to take it out 10 years and you want me to assume that we issue no debt after fiscal year 29? It's the last, we're going to issue in from fiscal year 25 through 29, and then no additional debt will be issued.
No,
Okay.
what I want to
Sorry.
see is what's realistic to expect.
Okay. So to us, what's realistic is that we would continue to issue debt and we would continue to defease, which again, like that's just to clarify that. So we can add additional years, but you're not going to see this drop off. You're going to see it level off right around 60 million.
Yeah, I guess.
And this goes back to that. If you're turning your debt, you know, you're issuing 50 million and you're paying it off, you know, every 5 years, you're paying 50 million a year. Right?
That's what you're doing. And I'm not accepting that as the smartest thing to do, but
Gotcha.
it's a scenario that I think I want to, maybe there's some a variety or alternative scenarios that we should look at with the chart, and that would be one, and maybe not defeasing debt would be another. I mean,
Okay.
we haven't always done that, right? That was something that we invented just a few years ago and have been taking advantage of. I guess it's an advantage, but I don't
Right.
really know. You know, that's another one of those. I mean, Ellen, you talked about finance speak. You understand what that is all about. I don't.
Sure.
And
Ellen, do you want to speak to that, or do you want me to speak just briefly to?
I can talk to it for a second, and then you're going to have to fill in. You're going to have to fill in. So the defeasance of the debt is basically we're doing a prepay. You know, when you have a mortgage payment, it's, you know, $2,000 a month, and you decide that, you've gotten a raise and you want to pay your house off early. So you're paying, $2,500 a month, or you get a bonus and you put the $10,000 directly against your principal. That's what defeasance is. It is taking cash that we have in the bank, which wastewater has a lot of cash, and then we pay off the debt. One of the reasons we started doing defeasance is because we have a lot of cash in wastewater. It was not the best optics to be sitting on, a lot of cash in wastewater. At the same time, we were going out saying we need this, 5-year plan of rate increases to cover the cost of RWRAC. So it was a two-part decision. We needed to borrow more debt. We needed to raise the rates to cover the debt. We got a lot of that cash in advance of us issuing the debt. So we're using that cash to pay off the debt as it was issued. So that's where we were going. Michelle, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think that was very well said. So we're basically trying to keep the debt service payments in that $60-65 million range. We have to be defeasing debt. And like Ellen said, the optics of having $120 million on the wastewater balance sheet in cash, including 40 million that's restricted, so 80 million unrestricted cash, and saying we need a rate increase, that was problematic. The rating agencies are looking for that ratio to stay above 1.3. In order to do that, I need the debt service in that 60-65 million range. So we're kind of multiple variables and trying to keep them all in balance for the department and for the utility.
So how did we become so flush with cash during a time when we have huge debt service obligations from RWRAC?
We raised the rates on all of the taxpayers for a number of years in anticipation of needing that cash in the future to pay for the ROMP project.
And so we raised the rates like 45% back before ROMP to be able to accommodate ROMP and as it's turning out, successive years.
Correct.
So we kind of did what Jackson was looking for on a year-by-year basis, all at once before ROMP.
Well, with the ROMP, and I was not in this position then, but I was in finance at that point. So I'm giving you what I remember from an anecdotal perspective. So other people on the call will correct me if my memory does not serve me well. With ROMP, we were looking at a multi-year huge increase in what we needed cash to buy. So what we put together was a multi-year rate plan analysis so that we could go to the board one time and say, in order to do this huge investment that we needed to do, we also need to plan to increase our rates rather than going to the board every 6 months or every year with a 3%, a 2%, a 5%, whatever we were doing. We went to them with a plan. And that plan was a multi-layered, multi-year plan to increase rates over time to pay for this huge investment that we were doing. That's my recollection of the thought process and of the methodology in a very high level that we went through. The result of that was we knew we were going to be collecting cash in advance of needing to pay the debt. Hence the reason to start, we set aside the $40 million in cash for the emergency. We set aside, or 20 million. We set aside another 20 million for basically it's some percentage of expenditures. We said to the rating agencies, we're always going to have at least $50 million cash in the bank that we're never going to touch. That's another one of those buckets of cash. And then we were left with this other quite significant amount of cash. So we are trying to pay down that debt as it was being issued. That was the goal, was to raise rates, to have the cash come in so that we could borrow the money, using the cash that was coming in to pay down the debt in an accelerated fashion, so that we could move wastewater. As Jackson had indicated, we had significant infrastructure improvements that needed to happen. And so that was the plan to do that.
Yeah, and Matt, it wasn't all before, because our last ROMP identified rate increase was it was 10% in 2013. That's at the end of ROMP, and that's what was determined was needed to cover all the costs. And ROMP did come in ahead of schedule and under budget at $600 million. But the only rate increase we've had since that last ROMP pre-approved rate increase was a 3%, and I think it was 2016-17. And that was one that, finance worked on and said, yeah, we, just where things are headed, we better bump it up a little bit to make sure we keep ourselves in good financial situation. So it's been 7-8 years since a rate increase, and it was 3% back then when it was, and that was well after ROMP ended in 2013. It was in 16-17. So that's where we've been.
So are we still generating excess cash? I mean, I say excess, but from year to year, are we still generating enough? Well, are we still generating excess cash? I guess that's the question.
So I do not have the cash flow in front of me, but we are still generating enough cash to be able to continue to defease $20 million a year in debt. So I'm not sure that I can answer your question.
No, I think that answers it. At least answers where I think I was headed.
And Matt, if I could just, like, if you looked at fiscal year 20, the unrestricted cash was 82 million. And if you looked at fiscal year 23, the unrestricted cash was 83 million. So it's more, it's steady, and that's including. So even though I'm defeasing each year, I'm keeping the same cash balance. So the defeasance is not reducing the cash balance, which was actually the initial intent of it. It's keeping the cash, the unrestricted cash balance static or somewhat static. Does that make sense? So that I'm covering my operating costs. I'm able to defease somewhere in the vicinity of 20 million a year, and I still have the same amount of cash at the end of the year that I had at the beginning of the year.
So what would happen if we did not defease like we used to not defease? That then our debt service payments would be
They would balloon up.
sorry?
The debt service payment is going to balloon up from the
Right.
60 million immediately up into the 70s, because when I'm defeasing, I'm usually defeasing a portion of the next year's debt. So we would violate the rating ratio at this point, because we have structured all the debt issues with this assumed defeasance in mind. So if we're not going to defease, we're either going to have to restructure debt to be interest only for a couple of years to try to keep those payments, which again, all of those decisions have impacts, right? If you do a mortgage interest only for the first couple of years, you're paying a whole lot more interest at the end of it than the person who just chose to chip away at it. So, there's not a ton of savings involved each time we defease, but it keeps the debt service payments level. And that's where our goal has been. It's keeping our cash balance level, and it's keeping our debt service payments level.
And the debt service payments are being created under a plan where at this point it's amortized over 10 years.
Correct.
And so to get the debt service lower without defeasance, you'd have to extend your payback period.
Or borrow less.
Right.
But
which,
you can't borrow less, but you can't use the extra cash because of the county's expenditure limitation. So the only way to borrow less is to not spend as much, not do some of the projects you're gonna do. You can't just say, oh, look at all this extra cash, we'll use it to pay for debt up front, because I think the expenditure limitation is what I always heard was the limiting factor on that end.
That is one of the things, but yes, you're correct, Jackson. It would be spend less. Spend
Which I
less
don't-
to me means borrow less. But
Yeah,
you are correct.
I don't think we want the tail wagging the dog. We want to spend what we need to spend. The question is how to structure our debt program to make it be sensible and and have as little adverse impact on the ratepayers as is necessary. I'm going to open it up to other committee members and see if anybody else has questions or comments that would help us clarify the situation we're looking at, which I still see as pretty muddy. But any other comments there from the subcommittee members?
I would just say that I find this discussion very helpful, and some surprises in it, actually, particularly with regard to the cash on hand and how to deal with it. So yeah, I apologize I wasn't here on time. I got delayed in another meeting, but yeah, I feel like this is very useful. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire.
I thought with that cash on hand, we should look at a director bonus or something, but.
No, don't you think you should, like, what about us, Just joking.
Well, I guess I'm in a situation where, and I think I share the status with other committee members that we are not finance professionals. We don't know all the ins and outs and angles that can be pursued to manage the huge financial requirements that this department has. And I need help. We need help from Jackson and the department, or Ellen and her department, to really be able to analyze the current situation, appreciate the analysis of the future situation, and be able to make a recommendation both to the department and to our elected officials. I'm currently feel pretty inadequate to be able to do either one of those things right now.
Armando?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the attempt to dumb it down to my level, because as Matt said, this stuff is really way beyond my comprehension just walking in. But I also think that we need a little bit more information, extend it out a little bit further, just to see what the possibilities could be. Now, I don't know how much further out, but I wonder if there's a way to compare our little sphere to others. And that may be a little far-fetched, but that's my line of thinking. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Armando. I think your point of looking at possibilities is what would be best for us. If we could do a variety of scenarios, and I think not only the scenario that we talked with Michelle about, extending out the current debt service graph, but looking at other scenarios and possibilities regarding the three pillars. I mean, I'm hearing that those are up for discussion, and I think this committee is postured and expected to weigh in on decisions exactly like that. So I'd like to be able to learn more about the factors that'll go into making decisions on where we proceed with those 3 pillars, whether they should change, whether there should be others, or what the foundational policy should be for the county, for this enterprise fund going forward. So help us with some scenario planning, I guess is what I'm saying.
Okay, so what we'll do is, what finance will do is Michelle will go ahead and give you another debt graph. But in addition to that, we will do a scenario on the workbook. So let me share my screen again just for a second. So we will develop another scenario that looks very similar to this. It will include the following things: change the rate on the service charge to keep its relationship between growth, so the volume charge and the service charge. It's currently at approximately 50% each, to keep that relationship.
Ellen, sorry to interrupt you, but that's not what I'm intending to state here. I want to
Okay.
just, I mean, right now, the rate factor, and, you know, it just coincidentally that it's close to 50-50 right now. I'm not so worried whether the rate versus the service is 50-50. I just think both components should be increased the same amount, and that could stray away from an exact or close 50-50. It may start separating a little, but you know, if, for instance, you really were going to do a 3% rate factor increase, I would say do the 3% service charge increase as well. So keep the rate increase the same for both components. So whatever the percent is, it's, you know, if somebody said, hey, how much are you raising wastewater fees? And you said 3%, well, no, it's about 1.5% based on what I see in front of me right now in 25-26. I want to make sure if, you know, both of them were 2%, then I could say truly it's a 2% rate increase because both components are being increased 2%. But,
Okay.
you know, so just, I mean, it may be very close and, you know, minutia here, but all I'm saying is keep whatever the rate increase is needed to achieve the objective in the rate workbook, make sure they're the same increase for both components.
Thank you for that clarification. So we will have an increase on both the service charge and the volume rate, and those percentages will remain equivalent to garner the revenue that is necessary. We are looking at feathering in an increase in the connection fee, which is now called the sewer utility fee revenue. We will change the inflation rate factor on expenses to increase in 26 to 4, and then drop it back down to 3 going out. We will also include an increase in revenue from Sarita to cover 25% of the planned CIP expenses on those 2 projects. So that will inform how some of the math works. We will also extend past the 5 years so that you can see what the debt service is doing. We will continue to assume that we will have debt service, or that the debt will be paid off in 10 years, and that we're going to try to keep the debt service at the 60 to 65. If we can't, debt service is the one that will float. We will keep the 10-year debt payment as the constant, so you can see what that does. And we will continue to use additional cash to defeat. We can go through and run some of these scenarios. When would you like to meet again?
Hey, Ellen, one more thing, and it's just a request, and you guys, I'll leave it in your court to assume, but when Michelle was talking about the 5% interest rate for the borrowed money, she talked about the discount, and so I wasn't sure I completely understood if 5% is what gets multiplied times each of the respective borrowed amounts, or, I think we use we actually realized a 3.8% or something on one of the examples. I just want to make sure we don't get overly conservative on that value and make it high just to be safe. Let's be careful what number we pick, whatever that means to you guys in that evaluation.
Okay, and so what Michelle was saying, we use a 5% coupon that gets us a real interest rate of about 4%. Currently, Treasury bills, pardon? What that gets us is, as we're looking at the market, Treasury is issuing at just under 4%. So we believe that that number, that 5%, is the good number to use. It takes into consideration the premium that we'll get, and it is in line with what our financial advisors and other financial entities are using. It gets us to that true interest cost of just under 4%.
Okay, thank you.
But just as an aside, that is something that we look at all of the time. And if our financial advisors were to recommend, 4.5, we would certainly use that. Right now, they are recommending to us the 5%.
So to your question about when do we want to meet next, at the next RAC committee meeting in February, as I recall, Claire, we have on the work plan to, I think, receive the report on the financial plan. I think we want the rate workbook at a point where we think that's a good picture for the committee. So I would think we'd want to get together sometime between now and then, early enough to allow finance to be able to produce a draft of the workbook for the main subcommittee.
I don't have the work plan in front of me. I'm trying to pull it up. Wait, let me look for it. I can find it. Okay, I have it here.
Yeah, it says rate workbook review on February 22nd. That's the next RWRAC meeting, the 22nd of February. And it does show 2024 rate workbook review and the fiscal year 23-24 budget expense and revenue. Oh, that's the normal one that goes in there. So the rate workbook is on the agenda for the next February, which is kind of the right timing to make sure we're in action about what we're going to do for recommendations or support anyway.
And just to add on to that, the next month we have a financial plan draft review. So we do have a little bit of time before that. And then the budget request review is the following month. So it's all lined up. It's like somebody planned it.
Better to be lucky than good. Remember that.
So in order to have a good rate workbook draft by the 22nd, Ellen, when should we have a conversation about the things that you're thinking about? Or we're,
I would say that it needs to be like the 15th or the 16th of February.
okay. Then let's ask Jeanette to try to set something up on the 15th or 16th with all of us. And also, Jeanette, would you send out the workbook draft that we've seen up on the screen today? So we can have that as a starting point.
Of course, I thought it was attached to the RAC meeting calendar invite.
So
If not, I will forward it.
yeah, all I
Yeah,
got,
the assumptions are on there. The assumptions
the
you should have in your
assumptions.
email.
right?
But they want that whole page, that whole
Ah,
sheet.
Ellen, could I get that from you then, please?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And then I'll forward it to all members.
Great.
On the 15th of February, is there a preference, morning, afternoon? Or is everybody pretty much open?
I'm out of town, but I will try to do it from remotely if I possibly can, but.
Okay.
And I'm retired, so it doesn't matter.
All right, so I will send out some options for the 15th. And
Let's see,
we'll see what respects.
Eric, I think you were gonna comment on your timing or your preference.
I'm better in the morning than the afternoon.
Okay. Claire, is that acceptable? Asia?
I'm visiting people. I don't know what their schedule is, and
Okay.
but I think the morning would be preferable.
All right, and is there going to be a time change for you?
Yes, I'll be about an hour later.
Okay.
Exactly an hour later, actually, not just about.
Okay.
47 minutes later, right, Claire?
That's right. That's right. 47 minutes later.
I think, Armando, how about you?
Well, I'm trying to figure out if that's 1/6 or 1/5 February.
I think
15
she
or
said she
6
was gonna look at 1/5 a Thursday, but
Thursday.
1/6 would be a backup plan.
Okay. 9 or 10 o'clock works for me either way. At this point, my calendar is not filled with any kind of appointments. So we're good.
I will say the 16th is probably harder for me. So if we could do the 15th.
Understood.
The Thursday is good.
Yeah, Thursday is better.
Okay.
Asia, do you have a preference?
The morning of the 15th looks good for me too. Is that where we were?
Yes, ma'am. Ellen, how is that for you?
I'll
For
make
your
it work.
schedule? All right. Alrighty, so I'll send out for Thursday, the 15th in the morning.
Very good.
Thank you.
Well, being in the position where we are that we just talked about the next meeting, which is item 4 under H, any future agenda items beyond those that we've set up during this meeting and as summarized by Ellen. Armando.
Yeah, pertaining to the bonus that Jackson is gonna get, and the fact that we're meeting the following day after Valentine's, I would expect him to give all of us chocolates, whether he has to deliver them or send them.
No, he needs to hand deliver them to everybody's door.
Is everybody comfortable with the format being Teams on the computer? Obviously Claire would be, but is there any advantage anyone would prefer to have by meeting in person? Hearing none, we'll go with the teams only then. So I heard no other future agenda items. I'll make a final call to the audience. And hearing none of that, any last minute comments from the committee members, subcommittee members, or staff? And hearing nothing, I'll.
Good. Sorry. I think it was a
Good.
good meeting today. A lot of information to absorb, but we hadn't had a meeting in what, a year? And this is a good one.
Good. Well, I appreciate your input, Armando, and everybody else's as well. Thanks to Jackson, Ellen, Michelle, and your teams for getting us to this point. And Eric, you got a comment?
Yeah, I was curious if we would see some of this charts and everything prior to the meeting, so we can go through and pin the tail on the points that we're worried about or concerned.
Yes, sir. I'll be getting that from Ellen and forwarding it to all of you.
That'll be great.
Jeanette, you're gonna get the current one that was discussed today, but I think Eric's question is, can we get the one that we'll cover on the 15th with all these modifications or changes or iterations that Ellen and Michelle talked about? Can we get that one sent to the committee members before the 15th? You know,
Yes,
a
sir.
couple of days to give them a chance to look at it. I take it that was your question, right, Eric?
That's correct. Thank you.
And yes,
Yeah.
I'll get that from Ellen and Michelle before the meeting and forward it to all the members.
I'd like to target a week before if you can.
Thank you. What we'll try to do is after this meeting, Michelle and I will meet. We will figure out the timeline on what it will take us to get that done. And then I will let Jeanette know when to anticipate the file going to you, so that, yes, we will try to get it to you in advance. I will try to get it to you at least 3 or 4 days in advance, and we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, I think the notice for the subcommittee meeting needs to go out a week before, and if there's a way to get it included with that, I'd certainly appreciate it. I think that's about 2 weeks from now. Okay, again, thanks to everyone, and I'll look for a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
That's from Eric, and a second.
I'll second.
Thanks, Claire, and all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
See you all on the 15th, hopefully.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you
Thanks.
all.
Have a happy Valentine.